Hello, welcome back to the Metamorphic Site Productions podcast. This is the one for November. This will be the last video / content that will be out for the year of 2020 before we're taking our little break. Also, for this podcast, it will only be available on YouTube until about January, but after that time, it will be available for download on our SoundCloud. So, without further ado, let's get into it and talk about the platform. So, hello, Will. How are you?
I'm okay.
You're a little shy.
Just a little bit today.
Why? Why are you shy?
I don't know, it's one of those shy kind of days. I'm a shy guy.
Okay. Is this a bit? Yes. Okay. Well, I mean, this movie that we're talking about, I don't know if you can really be shy about it. I
don't want to tell anybody else I saw this movie.
Really? You're like, let's just keep that under wraps. How about we don't share that info? Because it was crazy. It was a crazy movie.
Yeah, a lot of blood, a lot of gore. They were trying to balance out the blood and gore, talking about deep philosophical issues. Every time there would be a deep thought, they would follow it up with here's a puddle of blood and stabbing and stuff that if you're squeamish, you really shouldn't watch this movie. If you can't handle a lot of gore, blood, nudity, you should probably not watch this movie.
Or just gross stuff.
Oh yeah, for sure.
There's a lot of just gross things that happen in this movie. Like people eating maggots to other people.
A lot of bathroom breaks in the film. I'm not saying you take a bathroom break while you're watching it. The characters take bathroom breaks very vividly in the film.
Other people's faces and food.
Yes.
Yeah, it's one of those movies. So this movie, let me check okay, we're good. This movie was Spanish. It was made in Spain, I believe. Originally, it was a foreign production, but it was made by Netflix. It was a Netflix original. And I don't know the name of the director. I can put that on the screen right now for the YouTube video. But it was a movie that I heard a lot about when it came out. Everyone's like, oh, you need to watch this movie called The Platform. And we watched it in September when I was starting to watch movies for Halloween. And we watched it late September. And I remember right after we were done, you were like, you have to talk about this movie. You have to do a video about this movie. And I was like, okay. And then as time went on, I was like, you know what? I don't think I can fit a video in, but we can talk about it on the podcast. And then it just happened to fall right into November, which is the month of Thanksgiving, which I thought was weirdly appropriate / ironic. But do you want me to just go over the basic plot and then you can fill some stuff in of the movie real quick?
Yeah, sure. Because no matter how many times I explain the plot or you explain the plot, it feels like a verbal explanation of the plot does not do it justice, in the sense it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense until you visually see it. But once you visually see it, you cannot get it out of your head.
Yeah, it is a very memorable film. Okay, so let's talk about so The Platform. It feels like this movie feels like when I was in high school or in community college, you go to an English class and they would have you read this really dark, heavy, hand-fisted short story. And then you would discuss it afterwards, be like, what's the symbolism behind this? This is what it felt like, this movie. It's a very high concept film. So
I would counter that. I would say this feels more like a philosophical class or a ethics class where they would bring you one of those no-win dilemmas that, they give you this prompt that either choice you make, there's always this consequence that, if you choose this route, you're this type of person, but if you choose that route, you're even worse. And so it's an intentional prompt to make you feel bad either way you choose.
I know, it was almost almost Franz Kafka. Is that his full name? Franz Kafka?
I thought it was Franz.
Franz Kafka-esque story meets like the trolley problem from, I think it's, you know what I'm talking about. We have to switch the tracks.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so the platform basically is about this vertical prison, but they don't specifically say it's a prison because not everyone that goes here is a prisoner. But it is a vertical building with 333 floors, or actually, I guess 334 because you have ground zero that's at the top. And at the very top is like this whole like America's Test Kitchen like esque very or like Gordon Ramsay like immaculate, you know, just everything's like caviar and like laden with, you know, gold flakes type of cuisine. And you have this guy running around that reminds me of Monsieur Gustave from Grand Budapest Hotel, who's like checking everything and making sure that everyone's doing everything perfectly. And they make this huge spread of like luxurious food. There's cake, there's fish, there's meat, there's vegetables, there's, you know, everything that you could ever like think of. There's the appetizer and main course and dessert, beautiful, all in like silver pewter platters. And it goes on this big square table. And then the table lowers. And really, it's a platform that goes from the very top of this tower all the way down to the bottom. And the people, there are 2 people per like story, layer, floor of this tower, equaling into 666 people. So like, you know, and as it goes down, the people at the very top eat first. And then it goes down to level 2 and those people eat. And then it goes down to level 3 and those people eat. And then it goes down and it keeps going down, down, down until it goes to the very bottom. And then it goes back up. And the next day they make the food again. And so all these people have to share one big table of food. And it goes from top to bottom. And that's like the basic structure of the film. Then do you want to talk about like the main character and like how he like gets in there? The person we follow through the story.
So what's interesting about, I would say, the main characters of this film is that they don't give you a whole lot of backstory to any of them. They give you very, very little, almost enough information to put maybe in like a small paragraph. So the main character was promised that if he spent 6 months in this, what they eventually say is an experiment. If you spend 6 months in this experiment and endure it, at the end of the 6 months, you will get a prize. And it's a prize of your choosing. So for him, he chose a degree, an academic degree. And so instead of having to go through classes, he will get this degree by going through this experiment. But each person has this unique desire that they will achieve if they survive. So he wants the academic degree, but he's told it's just an experiment. While his cellmate that he is with was a criminal who murdered somebody, and so he is being put in here as a punishment rather than as an experiment. And so each person in this place has a different purpose for being there and a different outcome for them leaving. So one person will have served his time instead of going to jail, and the other person will get a reward.
And they bring in one item.
Yes. Each person gets one item of their choosing. So the prisoner, the guy who murdered somebody, gets a knife.
Oh, it was like the whole thing that why he committed his crime. He like he didn't commit the crime with
the knife.
But like it was the reason why he committed his crime.
Right. But we could skip that whole thing because it's not important to the story as much as it's showing that each person has a reason for being there. They have one item they're allowed to bring with them, any item that they want, and then they have a certain time limit they must endure the test for. So for the main character, his time is 6 months, but I believe the other man who was the murderer is a year.
Yeah, and then I think it's important to clarify that you start out on a certain level in the prison or in the tower, and every month you are shifted to another level. So you don't stay on the same level for the whole time. So when they wake up, they're like on level 48, I believe. And then the next month, they're like on level 132. And then at one point, he gets to level 6. So
what's important to understand also about these levels is when you start off at the top at level 1, you can have as much food as you want. But however much food you eat will be gone for the next level and be gone for the next level. So as it goes down, there's less and less food because people are not saving food for the people. So the higher the number of floors. So if you're in a floor 100, you're getting scraps. And if you're below 100, 132, you're getting nothing.
Right. So some people, when they wake up and realize they're on level 150, will just kill themselves because there's like, how can I survive a month without food? And if you get 2 low levels like that in a row, like you're on 150 and the next you're on like 96 or something like that, like they're like, I'm not living, because you're going 2 months at that point with nothing. So people will resort to killing themselves, killing each other, eating each other, and things like that. So as you go farther down the tower, the platform, the more desperate and the more bleak it is. So that's like the basic overview of the plot of the film. We'll go a little bit more into like the actual plot of what's going on, unless we want to talk about like. So the main character's name is Goring, and he brings in a book called Don Quixote, which is a famous, like a classic literature, which I've never read. Have you read Don Quixote?
No, I the times that I had heard it referenced, it's always considered like this infamous book that is so symbolic and supposed to be, symbolic of like masculinity and blind ambition, and it's never really just taken at face value. It's always got this kind of hook symbolism in it.
Yeah, he brings that copy in and he reads it for like 6 months. And we watched a video that said that Don Quixote and like what they talk about in the film mirrors Goring. So Goring has these idealistic values and he believes in them, but trying to implement them in the real situation, it doesn't really go anywhere because other people don't listen to him. Mm-hmm. So he starts out in this prison and he immediately is like trying to break the system. He's like, okay, well, what if we just save the food when it comes down, we keep some, and then they pretty much force you not to do that. So he tries to keep an apple the first time he gets the platform, comes to him, and the room becomes really, really hot. And he has to throw the apple back because if you try to keep food, either it becomes too hot or too cold and you'll die there. So you can't keep food. And then he tries at different points to talk to people above him and below him to ration out the food. And they're just like, forget you. No, I'm starving. I need this food. And the people who are above him immediately act like they're better. They always act like they're better than the people below them, even though like a couple days ago they were possibly below them. And so he tries to break the system and quickly realizes that it's such a desperate, intense, there's a better word I'm looking for, but I can't think of it right now, situation that trying to appeal to people just isn't working, even though technically they're all in this together, where they're all in the same system. So that's kind of like what the whole thing with his book and like his character comes into play. And then he has this roommate. Do you want to talk about the guy with the sword, not the sword, the knife?
Well, so the guy with the knife had been there for a lot longer. So when the main character wakes up for the first time, he wakes up with somebody who had been there for already a couple months. So he already got the experience of being on a high floor and being on a low floor, and he understands that you have to be ruthless to survive. That's his philosophy. There's less about kindness and mercy and more about you do what it takes to survive no matter what. And so you're willing to cross boundaries, you're willing to break social cues to survive. And so you become very cold and calculated, and you wait your time. So if you're on a higher floor, you don't care about the people around you. You just survive you eat whatever you want to eat and you move on. But if you're on a lower floor, you are willing to kill someone to survive. You're willing to kill and eat them to survive, because it's all about survival at the expense of everyone else but yourself.
Yeah. So if you're above, you don't care about the people below, but if you're below, you care about the people above because they are determining if you eat or not. And then he has this roommate, and that guy is crazy. They get to a floor that's too low, and he ties Goring up, the guy with the knife, and he's like, I'm just going to slowly cut you to pieces and eat you, which is what we were talking about earlier. Was like, if you have a easily queasy stomach, this is something maybe you shouldn't watch. And so then there's this other prisoner who I forget her name, but it's a woman, and she rides the platform down like every day. And Goring's like, what is she doing? And his roommate's like, oh, she's looking for her child. And he's like, how is there a child in here? And he's like, I don't know. She does it every month, trying to look for her child. And at one point, she saves Goring from being killed and eaten by his roommate and kills him. And then they have to eat the roommate because there's no other option. And so, like, do you want to talk about the symbolism of like cannibalism in this movie? Because there's a couple times people are eaten by other people.
So I think it kind of goes into like the whole dog eat dog world, is that you're willing to do whatever it takes to survive at whatever cost. And so there are some philosophies out there that would tell you to forget about the other person in the world around you. Don't care about your other people, your neighbor. You do what it takes to get yourself to the top. And so, the character of the old man, the murderer, is really showing like this philosophy of like being willing to do whatever it takes. And so when Goring kills him and eats him, he is haunted by the ghost of the old man, and the old man's basically telling him, see, I told you. You tried to hold to your philosophies, you tried to hold to your morals, but in the end you became just like me. You did exactly what I had to do to survive, and now you're no better than me. You're the exact same way. You're in the same mentality that I am, that you're doing whatever it takes to survive.
I don't know if you noticed. Well, I mean, they kind of specifically call it out, but at one point they make a connection, or they make a reference to communion, when like of eating like the blood of eating the flesh of Christ and drinking his blood. And I think because like Spain is mostly Catholic, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And I've noticed a lot of Catholic cultures produce a lot of criticism on Catholicism in their films. Catholics have the belief, I forget what it's called, the term for it, but like that when the transubstantiation, that when the bread and the wine are like consecrated, or when they are in they're blessed, they actually become the body and blood of Jesus, which I think is kind of being called upon here, because his first roommate is not the only roommate he eats or cellmate. There's a woman after his old cellmate who they end up getting to a really low floor, and she kills herself, and so he ends up eating her, and her ghost tells him that she specifically hung herself so that he could eat her and survive. And so going to like, it's a very incorrect like connection to make it to communion, because communion, what is talked about in the Bible, comes from a Jewish perspective much more than does a Catholic perspective, because it's during the Passover meal and things like that. So in like Jewish tradition, when they used to sacrifice, they had to eat the sacrificed lamb or whatnot that was a part of like the ritual. And so that's where the idea of like communion comes from, that Jesus is the perfect sacrifice and that his blood was spilled and we like eat of his sacrifice. But also they talk about communion as a way to be connected to God. And in Jewish tradition or belief, that if you broke bread with the same person, so if you ate from the same loaf, like you were spiritually connected at that point. And I thought about how everyone in this movie acts like they're so different from each other when they're on their certain levels, but they all eat from the same food. And they all commune over the same food. And then they had this whole thing about eating each other and like the references to communion and like, oh, now like that you ate me, like I'm a part of you and things like that. It was I felt like a very strong message of like how differences don't really matter in the grand scheme of things, how we're all human and we're all, and it's not necessarily a Christian film, but like in my mind, it was like, well, we all fall short of the glory of God. We're all in the same pit. And that, you know, yeah, some people are wealthy. Some people have access to more resources. Some people are, but that doesn't matter. We're all sinful and we're all on the same like level in that way. I don't know if that was a really long, confusing tangent. I was just trying to get through my thoughts, but
I actually would kind of make a little bit of more broader strokes here and say that their reference there was less about like a target against Catholicism or communion and more of a target against anybody in a position of power, authority, or in the higher ups of society. So the whole movie is kind of making jabs at the elite, the wealthy, the powerful, the government, any kind of institution in society that has strong influences or guidance or control. And so I think this was a jab at religion in general, and this idea of that, you know, the way that they're portraying humans, the way they're portraying governmental political systems, the way they're portraying the rich, the powerful, the elite, is that they are all manipulative and greedy and selfish, and they are not looking out for anybody, and that when you're right, when it comes down to it, everybody acts the same to each other. Everyone's selfish and everyone is going after themselves, but it looks different on different levels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I have some talking points kind of segueing into what you were talking about. And the first one, I showed it to you and you were like, do you even know about this? And I was like, I know that they mentioned it as a thing that's they're supposed to be calling it out in the film. So it's the idea of trickle-down economics. And Will, my lovely husband, we just had our big wedding this weekend. Woo! As he like blows his nose. But he's taught economics in the past, and he's talked about it along with different like you're just shaking your head. He's just waiting to okay, so Will's a high school teacher. He's taught economics before. So let's talk about trickle-down economics. What do you think the movie had to say about trickle-down economics? Did it have anything to say about trickle-down economics, really?
No.
No.
The whole no. It's so I think in my personal opinion is that is that the movie, while masquerading as very deep and, you know, challenging these deep philosophical ideas, it's a very age-old discussion of the people who are on the bottom don't get treated fairly by the people on the top. And in reality, it's dog-eat-dog world. Everyone should be against each other because everyone is selfish, and even the people with high morals are going to end up just like everyone else. And the only hope is that one day the people above us will see how poor and how destitute the lowest class are, and hope and pray that they will come to our rescue. So I wouldn't say trickle down economics as much as what I told you is this idea of anything anti-rich, anti-powerful in favor of the lower, the weaker. And so as also a political teacher, someone who has taught politics and economics, I believe it's more a interpretation of like socialism and communism and capitalism, and it's a political statement on those institutions. So yes, trickle down economics is a part of the capitalist model, but these are more broad strokes that I believe this movie is attacking. And this idea that that if society was to work better, is that everyone would share, but nobody can share because everyone is selfish.
Yeah, that's an old argument. I mean, I remember taking a fascism versus anti-fascism class in college, which is pretty much we talked about like so Nazis were fascism, but then you had like communism, which was supposedly anti-fascism, but then we talked about totalitarianism, which pretty much says that they're equal in like what their intent. They just have different morals that they espouse, but they take control in like the same way, and each of them end up into this thing where there's like the haves and the have-nots. The people who have power have, and the people who do not have power do not. And so it doesn't matter what system you espouse, like human nature creates this divide where the people who can have will take more than they need and won't give to those who do need. And then this film argues that if the roles are reversed, they will do the people who didn't have anything will do the exact same thing, which I think is interesting, that they're saying it's not like an inherent, like, oh, the rich are inherently evil. They're saying that people are inherently evil, and that it just depends, like whatever level they're on, they're going to act the same towards each other, which I thought was very interesting, especially now. A lot of people, I think, assume that if you're poor and you have a harder life, that it makes you a better person, like just instinctively, because like, oh, you like, yeah, like eat the rich, like the rich are so greedy and they don't understand, and they're so evil because they have all the money and stuff. But this movie is like, well, if that was you, if you were in their position right now, you would be just the same.
Right. I would agree. And I think there's an element that they kind of address later in the film. So later in the film, after the main character has pretty much done some horrible and abysmal things, he gets to one of the top floors and he meets a new person, somebody brand new, who's trying to escape. And he fails, and he realizes that the real goal right now is to work together and actually pursue this idea of everybody getting their equal portion. And the whole idea, Goring's plan is, okay, we're going to go down each floor, because we're on floor 6. We're going to go down each floor. We're going to hoard the food on the platform. So we're going to stand on the platform. We're going to hoard the food, and we're going to give it out to the people. So they're only going to get the portion they need. And we're going to keep going down. And we're going to get to the bottom. The whole hope is that we'll get to the bottom, and then we'll ride the thing all the way up to the top floor, and we'll get out. But then you start getting into more philosophical stuff. They couldn't have just kind of cut it there. So they're saying that no matter your efforts, it's still not going to work, because they're getting to more and more floors, and more people are dead or attacking them or trying to kill them. And they finally get towards the bottom, and they almost die. And his friend dies, and he is like bloody in a heap. And they find a little girl,
supposedly the child that the woman was looking for. And the ending is that they send her up. And that is like, oh, like you were saying that earlier, like, oh, hopefully the people at the top will realize what's going on and they'll care enough to change. And so they send the girl up in hopes that she will change them in some way. And that, what was I gonna? You can go on. I was gonna say something I forgot.
So my issue is that every time you think they're going to have a message and a solution, they keep countering it with more intrigue and more conversation pieces. And so it doesn't feel like they had a set definition they were trying to get across. They didn't have a set meaning. And when it comes down to it, is you're left with this image of this girl riding up the platform to the top with no result, no resolution, and every effort by the adults failed. Every person who tried to do something good was killed. And so it leaves you believing that, first off, it believes that, okay, everybody's evil, everybody's selfish. And when it comes down to it, even if you had all the money in the world, you'd still end up being selfish. Okay. Then what's the next step? All right. Well, you have a meaning, a solution. And then it's like, well, when it's up to you, you need to step up and do your part. But every time the person did his part, he got cut down, literally cut down. And so it feels like, in my opinion, that the movie was trying to have so many influential and political and philosophical conversations at once, and it didn't really hone in on one key thing it could have told a story. It was hitting like all these different buttons, attacking religion, attacking government, attacking the wealthy, attacking humanity, and then it was showing like the depravity of humanity, how terrible we can be at our worst. I used to have a teacher who used to say, anybody is capable of anything when put into the right circumstances, and this movie really shows that if you are that desperate, you could do that. And that's the thing. They are taking a lot of assumptions that everybody put in these circumstances is going to either murder somebody, kill themselves, or result in like doing some debaucherous thing. And it just doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense that everybody that they encounter has some kind of disgusting like fallout and fall apart in their lives whenever they're in this place. There's not a group of people who would band together to try to help.
So I remember when we were watching one of the videos was talking about this film. They were saying, one of them said something about the individual can be correct and the majority can be incorrect. Because Goring is one of those people you're talking about. He's our main character. He tries, and his roommate at the end, I guess, would also be. He believes in him, and then they meet that old man. Remember the old man that tells them, like, this is a good thing you're doing, but you need to do it a certain way and not be, like, you need to have a clear message and things like that. So there are people in the system, and I guess the woman who kills herself that has the cancer, his one cellmate, she tries to ration out the food to help other people. So not everyone in the film is horrible.
Well, that's my problem, though. Is every person that you try to get behind in their message gets killed or kills themselves.
Right.
So, and that's the other thing. Each person's message is different. It feels like one of these like quests you go on and you run into a different wise person, and that wise person has some kind of different message. The woman is very much representing like the socialist communist model of like everybody gets their portion, everybody gets an equal share, and nobody wants to listen to her, and she's this valiant hero that is standing up for everything right. But then she loses hope and she kills herself, but she gives her body to her cellmate to eat. Okay? And then he runs into his new partner who tries to escape because he's hoping and believing that the people above him will have a heart enough to help him out. And then they reject him. And so he decides to team up with Goring to do Goring's plan. And they run into the other guy who says, hey, we have to have a clear message. So the clear message is try to share the food, and if nobody wants the food, kill them. That's his message. And so
his message was to save one dish and send it back up.
Right, but that if anybody tries to oppose you, you kill them to protect the dish.
What I was going to say before, when you're talking about all these different aspects of the film, and they're like, it just hits all these buttons, and it just goes all these different like sides and angles. So I think what they're just trying to do is just trying to show this very complicated issue, just plainly show it and not try to give any specific message with the film, like a little bit at the end. But I think the reason why it's so ambiguous because they're trying to be like, this is how complex this issue is of greed in people. And it's not just a one note thing. So I think that's why they add so many elements in there, because in reality, there are so many elements to it.
And while I would agree with you, if you're going to do that, you really should do it as a documentary and not as a thriller, horror, action film with blood and guts, and making every time you think you're like making the message so ambiguous that every time a new part of it pops up, it gets covered up by something else. Something else overrides it. So you don't have time to think about anything. It's like, okay, well, this is an issue. No. That's the issue over there. And so I get it that it's a multifaceted issue, this idea of equality and opportunity and, equalizing the world. But to do it in such a way that is grotesque and abrasive, it takes away from your message, and it leaves a bad taste in your mouth, because all you're remembering is every time I try to settle on thinking about this movie, I remember how gross it was.
I think I side on the opposite side of you. Humbly disagree, just in the way that like I enjoy films that are very real when it comes to real things. So yeah, this movie was gross, and it had a lot of moments in it that were like, ooh, but at the same time, I like that it did show everything that it could think of about these different issues, and it had that complexity to it. I don't think that it's a disservice to the film for it to be fictional. I think that fictional films, I love when fictional films actually have a purpose and are not just for entertainment value. And that people have learned through stories for years and years and years and years, and it doesn't always have to be like a true story for it to be true in a sense. I think that the violence and the gore can be handled in a better way. I think it doesn't have to be so stark. Sometimes people go way too far with that, and I agree. But I think that sometimes visually telling a story, it can be done in a way that's very visceral, because the reaction that to get needs to be visceral. And that sometimes it's just the best way to tell your story is a way that makes the audience uncomfortable.
So I would agree, but the problem is, I feel like for a movie, they compressed way too much in a short time period.
Mm-hmm. I could see that.
I would also say that I would agree with the whole fiction idea, but my problem is that they were dealing with so many topics at the same time, and every time they offered a solution, they nixed the solution. And so they made it very abysmal, but also impractical. You mentioned the idea of like real, but the idea of people resorting to cannibalism and the idea of everybody having like this hugely like mutated and perverted selfish motive, it's not grounded in reality. So there was more pure evil in these people in this film just for the sake of a horror jump scare terrifying thing than an actual reality. So it wasn't that they were just outnumbered. It meant that even the people that you were looking up to, you're like, hey, that's the protagonist. He was awful. There was no character except for the little girl who had 0 lines that had pure motives, or at least had motives that you could get behind. And so every character, and I get what they're trying to say with that everyone's corrupted, everyone's got a selfish motive. But when you're trying to talk about a political, philosophical issue, you can't leave the audience without like a depressed, no hope mentality going out of it, because then they're going to be like, well, what am I supposed to do?
I think that was the whole point, because that's what he was like. They asked the director, like, what's the point? And he's like, you have to ask society that, which is such an auteur thing to say about your film. And that's such a like a you know, like, oh, I'm an artiste, you know, type of thing to say. But I agree with you that it might be too vast. It might be too like vast of a film where it's like, we're going to go after this huge massive topics. They could have honed in onto like one thing about this bigger picture of like greed and class system and focused on that instead of like everything at once. Do you think that would have helped the film?
Oh, for sure. So anytime you look at anything in history, in politics and economics, if you try to tackle a massive issue at all fronts, it will fail. It would have to be a miraculous situation. The way people, organizations, militaries tackle a big issue is you tack smaller topics, or you tack one section of it. All right. And so instead of being like, let's just go head on into this humongous issue that has been a problem since the beginning of time, let's actually make it palatable. And I understand you're trying to paint a picture, you're making an artist statement. But if you're going to have a deep philosophical conversation about a key topic that affects everybody in the world, then maybe tone back the art history and the in-depth philosophical things and get to, you have a problem, here's a solution. And here's something that I want to leave the audience with. I get it, you're trying to get the people to think. But if you leave people believing that the world is an abysmal, dark place, you're not going to accomplish anything.
Yeah. I think, I don't know about like giving a specific solution in what they were going to do, but going even more in depth into one philosophical point, one or two, instead of like 10. Like, I know it's like a complex issue, but trying to like go into like one big direction, I think would have been easier for people to think about this film. Now, I mean, I like that they showed the complexity of the thing that they're talking about, which, I mean, we can get into exactly what you think they're talking about. I think I think the big thing this film is talking about is the inherent greed in humanity and how that comes out in different ways and how it affects every person. But I mean, maybe you have a different idea of how, but like, I think what the people who made this film may not realize is what they're talking about. I think they think it's a part of it. I think that they think they're talking about our political and cultural systems that we've created and how we uphold something that's highly problematic. Like, it feels much more political and much more social. And I'm going with a much more like personal, spiritual, like, but I think that the core of it is really the inherent sin of like greed and selfishness in humanity and how that affects everyone. So like, what do you think the core of the film is? You can say like what you think the filmmakers think the core of the film is and like what you think the core of the film is, but.
So I honestly believe that the filmmakers are trying to get across this idea that working as a team, working in a group, depending on sharing and camaraderie, is a crapshoot. You probably will not get it to work because people have ulterior motives, people are selfish. So if you are to survive, you must be willing to do whatever it takes to survive and look out for yourself. And if you're put into the circumstance where you can do something, you should. But at the end of the day, your only responsibility is yourself. And so don't depend on the wealthy to save you, and don't depend on your friends to save you. Depend on yourself to save you. And if you are put in the circumstance to help a person impoverished or somebody who's struggling, you should do it. But understand that don't expect that back from them, because they will bite you back.
Yeah, that I could see where you're saying it's abysmal. I think what the filmmaker wanted was, hey, we need to fix this. But what you're saying is that they're already like saying we need to fix this, but it's not going to work because of how they've like portrayed people, which I can see, especially from a like, not saying you're a secular person, but from a secular point of view of like saying that all there is our own judgment and man, that this movie's like, well, there's no hope because people, we can't do it because people are too horrible, which I can see now what you're complaining about. But so do you think that's the actual core of the film, or do you think that's what the filmmakers think the core of the film is?
I think that is what the filmmakers were intending. Is they might be tossing this back at us and saying, okay, what are you gonna do about it? But the gist of the film, the main argument of the film, is that efforts are going to fail because people are selfish. I mean, the woman who wanted everyone to share, done. The man who wanted them to send a message, his message was not sent that he came up with. His message failed, and it got that man killed. The man who helped him killed. All right. The message that you can make it all the way and try to figure out your exit, was not going to work because he got killed. So any strategy they came up with, any hopeful strategy to help the guy who helped that woman, the guy who helped the woman who was like trying to find her daughter, his plan failed. She died. So anytime they presented an argument to try to fix a solution, it showed that they believed that working together and plans will fail. That the only way to survive in this world is to look out for yourself. And so they sent this back to the world and said, we made this movie that tells this message. What are you guys going to do about it? Are you going to realize that this is the reality, that you need to be more self-contained? Or are you going to try to fight the system, which will ultimately fail? Because that is what they proved. Every time they fought the system, it failed.
Yeah, I can see that now where you're like, hey, change. And then you're like, what's the point? People in the movie try to change. Nothing. Yeah, okay. I can see that now. Okay. So I have on here, I think the biggest thing to talk about with viewing this from a Christian worldview, I wrote down, what does God say about greed, gluttony, and charity? Which are all like kind of old Christian words. I think that we don't talk about, because like, so in Catholicism, they have like the mortal sins, which we don't believe in mortal and venial sin. We believe all sin separates us from God. There isn't like the mortal sins that will like, if you don't confess them before you die, you won't go to heaven, which is like the deadly sins are like greed and gluttony and lust and things like that.
But that is in the Bible.
Wait, which part?
The 7 deadly sins are in the Bible. There's a list of them.
Oh, really? Where chapter and verse?
I believe it is in the Psalms.
Okay. I'll have to look that up because I've never actually saw that they were physically in the Bible somewhere. But you agree that they're not like...
No, so as long as when you confess them, you're receiving redemption from them.
So I'm saying like if you were to lust and then like get hit by a truck right afterwards and you didn't have time to confess, but you believed in Jesus, would you go to purgatory or like you wouldn't enter into heaven because you committed a deadly sin?
No.
Okay, so that's what Catholics believe. Are you looking it up right now?
Yes.
So I know that like these things a lot of Protestants don't talk about them, but greed and gluttony are sins. They are legitimate sins that we should talk about more when it comes to our walk with Jesus and our walk as Christians. Charity is another one that we think, oh, charity is like giving to the poor, like on Christmas coming up. But so I think like the Puritans talked a lot about charity. Charity is just like, your love for your neighbor, correct? He's nodding his head. Yeah. And these are, things that we should discuss and talk about, and not treat like there's some ye olden time talk that like the Puritans talked about way long ago. They're very relevant for today.
Originally, charity also could be translated into love.
Right. So just love for your neighbor. Okay. So greed. I think our culture, Western civilization, especially America, greed is a sin that goes highly overlooked. So is gluttony. Gluttony is one that's even more overlooked, but greed is something like back in the 80s, they had like this whole thing where it was like, oh, it's kind of okay to be greedy. Do you remember that at all, learning about that?
The 80s?
Yeah, they kind of promoted that a little bit.
Yeah, so that is part of where capitalism kind of gets bit a little bit, is the idea that it promotes greed and it promotes mine. But that's not really, it shouldn't be promoted at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually greed destroys capitalism, in my opinion. When people are too greedy, it will destroy the system, and this movie proves it. So God he's concerned about everything, but when it comes to our personal relationship with him, he's concerned about what we're responsible for and what we can control in ourselves. You would agree? Mm-hmm. So greed is something, it's taking more than you need, especially when it's like to the harm of others. So I'm trying to think of a really good example, because even I don't think we're skilled a lot in our culture to recognize greed. I think we're told a lot in our culture that's okay to be more greedy than we need to be. I think like the way we consume is very greedy. Like we'll do a lot of things to make ourselves happy in like the time, but like not think of like the actual repercussions of it. Like we use a lot of like plastics. We have a lot of food waste. I'm just talking about our culture. You're looking at me like, what? I'm talking about like our culture, like that we live in. I don't know. we have a lot of food waste. We do a lot where we'll take a lot and we don't really think about like what we throw away. Like, oh, like I don't like this, I'm just gonna chuck it, and we don't realize like what we have. Sometimes we're not appreciative of it. And I don't think we realize how much we take on a daily basis. Do you have thoughts about that?
Well, I think that more than anything goes back to being a good steward of the things that we have. I don't think it's wrong to pursue, goals and aspirations. But when those goals and aspirations, those possessions become our primary focus, then it becomes greed. When our focus is attaining more things, then we become greedy. We become absorbed with that. So I think greed is really more than we actually need. And so you're right on the money there, but I think greed is also when we put that as like that, whatever that is, as our focus. So if it's money and attaining more money, that is greed. But having a lot of money doesn't mean you have greed. But it's if your focus is the attaining of more money.
Do you remember the parable about the servant that buried his money?
Yes.
Do you think that is something to do with greed? Because there's a parable that Jesus said about 3 servants, and they were given a sum of money by the master, and the master leaves. And 2 of the servants invest it and like make more. They make more money with their money. Do you remember that?
I don't think that's greed. Because
sorry, I stopped you. But the one that buried his money, and then he's like, yeah, I knew you were a harsh master, so I just buried it. Is he greedy? Because he was concerned about... Okay, no, you're shaking your head. Okay, go ahead.
With what?
I thought you were going to explain why.
Well, so he's poor. First off, he wasn't trusting of his master. Mm-hmm. Second off, he was a poor steward. He wasn't greedy in the sense like his goal was not to keep more of it. It was he didn't trust his master, and he was being a poor steward of the master's money that he had. So it wasn't his money; it was his master's money. He was supposed to invest it. He was supposed to do something with it.
I think that's an important part to bring up, is that we don't own money, and we don't own food, and we don't own anything. God owns everything. And so that's why we use the word steward. Is that, I think, a great mindset to get into that will help you fight against this idea of greed, of taking things without thinking about others and just taking and not caring about how it affects others, is not thinking, oh, I have the right to this, it's mine. It's not yours. All the money in your account you have right now does not actually belong to you. It belongs to God. And so you can give that money for God's services, and it's totally fine. Like if you were to tithe that money or give it to a missionary or to use it to feed the poor or whatnot, you are like the servants that multiplied their money, because you are using God's money the way that he would want you to. And so being greedy is claiming the money as your own and using it for your own devices, having no idea or thought about, what does God would want me to do with this money? It's really his. It's claiming it for your own. So what do you think about that? And, how it maybe is reflected in the movie with people being greedy?
I mean, so really the movie kind of takes like a cultural note and will say that the have-nots, when they get what they want, they will not share it with others. They won't share either. And they won't give back. And so if you don't have something and you get it, you're going to keep it to yourself. And so in the sense of like, that's not necessarily greed as much as it's possession, it's coveting, it's obsession. And I think there's an element of that too. But it's this idea, the movie says that if you don't have something and that's what you're pursuing and you finally get it, then it's the thing that you protect and you're not going to have, it owns you.
Yeah.
And that you're not going to, even when you need to share it with somebody else, you're not going to, because they didn't share it with you. And so you become selfish, and your nature is selfish, and there is no good. There are no people with good intentions or good hearts, and the ones that do will be corrupted very quickly.
Yeah. Well, the corruption comes from, I think, feeling justified to be selfish because everyone was so horrible to them.
Victim mentality.
Which is the challenge of the Christian in everyday life, because Christ says, you turn the other cheek. Christ says, forgive your neighbor 70 times 7. If they ask you for your coat, give them the shirt too, I think is what he says, right? Give them the tunic off your back as well. Like, just give till it hurts. Even if they don't treat you well in return. And that's part of the charity we're talking about, of like loving your neighbor in this world is so hard, because you can love people and they will hurt you with the next breath. You can give them something, you can help them, and they can hurt you in the next instant. And this movie kind of explores that, about how people are so angry and mean and selfish, and inherently so, that it does become very difficult to, do the right thing, the righteous thing, the holy thing of loving and, loving your neighbor. We can move on to talking about it a little bit, but I have gluttony written down. I wanted to talk about that because this movie does talk about gluttony in a very real way, where people who can have access to the food just gorge themselves. We don't talk about gluttony a lot in American Christian circles. It's another one that, I think greed is one that gets overlooked. I think gluttony gets overlooked even more. And gluttony is the idea of eating more than you need, is gorging yourself on food. And food is such an intimate part of our lives. And I think that we think, oh, food's just food. But how we treat food says a lot about how we treat ourselves and how we think about ourselves and the world. And gluttony, someone who's struggled with their weight and who's struggled with stress eating and things like that over their lives, gluttony is definitely something that shows you where your self-control is either strong or weak. And it shows you It shows you like how you can be weak to your flesh, because like gluttony is definitely something about like the physical hunger that you feel in many different real ways. But it goes hand in hand, I guess, with greed, because you're eating more than you need. And I think as a culture and as a not a nation, but like, yeah, as a culture and society, we've normalized that so much. Like, people come to America and they complain about how big the portions are or how small the portions are in other countries. But we've normalized like this gluttonous attitude. And it goes along with our greed, where we're like, oh, more is better. I can have as much as I want. It doesn't matter. I can have more than I need, way more than I could ever want. I should have that. So yeah, I think that it's so interesting. This film talks about food in that way. It uses food as this symbol of wealth and of resources and the people that have those things. But it also, in a very real way, talks about actual food and our actual attitudes towards feeding ourselves and then versus feeding other people. So move on real quick and then we'll wrap up. We talked about charity a little bit, but the Christian plight, and if we were to put ourselves into the platform as Christians, the biggest thing that would be the challenge for us, but also make us different, is the dedication to loving other people. Now, that'd be very hard, as Will pointed out, that like the people who do that in this film get beaten down real hard, real quick. Like, they want to help other people and immediately they're shut down. But that's just how the world is. So if we as Christians were in the platform, I think we would have to come to terms with loving our neighbor even when it gets extremely hard. Now, the film seems to tell us that that's hopeless and that it won't work and that people will, kill us. And that's nothing new to the Christian. I mean, we already know that the world is like that. But through Christ, we've already won. Christ came and he defeated death, and he defeated all those things that could hold us back. I mean, not even death can separate his love from us. So I think the thing that would separate us within this situation is that even if we were to starve to death or be killed, we wouldn't give in, or at least that's what we would strive to do, is to not give in. And that's what we strive to do now, is to not give in to the selfish, sinful ways of the world, even when the world tries to force us to do so by its circumstance. Also, I think it's important to realize that we would have to hold on to God's righteous ways, and vouch for those in this world, even though it's a dog-eat-dog world, technically. So like this film talks about different ways to solve this problem. It could be through, a right use of trickle-down economics. It could be through socialism or communism or capitalism. It talks about all these different issues, and it says, well, what if we did this? What if we did that? What if we forced people to share, which would be almost like a totalitarian type thing. But the issue still comes, and that is that those at the top with the power will abuse it. But if we supplement that, if we change that out for Jesus, if we put God at the top, if we put him as the top with all the power, then suddenly everything fits into place. Christ should always be at the very top. He should always be on the throne of our hearts. And if we do everything with that in mind, what we do to serve others and love others and be charitable towards others and to resist greed and gluttony is not for our own benefit, but for the benefit of others, because Christ has made it possible for us to do so, because God is at the top, because he is a trustworthy and lovely God, someone who deserves praise and worship, but also is someone who loves us deeply. The system will then work. That's what we are hoping for. We're hoping for order to be restored in earth and heaven throughout our lives by God and Jesus' return. So that's important to remember, that though there are people at the top right now, and yeah, we can send them a message, the person at the real top is God, and that he is already on our side, and that we should be doing that which he asks us, which is to be charitable and loving, not greedy, not to play by the system that those at the top and the bottom and in the middle all play by, but to play by his system, his rules, and to live completely differently than those who live here. That'll be it for this podcast. This will be the last podcast of this year. We'll be back hopefully in January with either a new video or a new podcast. We're not sure yet, but we are so excited to end 2020 and go into a new year, hopefully with new exciting things, more than this year. But we wanted to wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy Hanukkah and Kwanzaa if you celebrate that, and a Happy New Year. And we'll see you in 2021, guys. So thank you so much, and bye.